Hi, Dave Coplin here, bringing you another weekly live stream. This time we are dialing into the future of work, looking again at education. I am absolutely thrilled and delighted to have this report hot off the press. This is from JISC, the organisation who works in higher education. It was a report that was published on the 4th of November. We're now on the 11th of November, and I am absolutely thrilled and delighted to have Louisa Dale, Director of Insight at JISC, who was the author of this report, with us in the studio today. Louisa, how are you doing?
I'm pretty good, thanks. It's been an intense 5 months, so I'm enjoying a little bit of downtime. This is how I like to spend my downtime, Dave.
Yeah, okay, thanks for that. You must be knackered. I mean, this report alone is an impressive bit of work. And I know that you, I mean, like you say, you've been working on it for months, but it isn't just you sitting in a dark room either. Talk to us about the report. We've actually talked about you before, not just you specifically, but just because you produced a report earlier in the spring, at the beginning, if you like, of the first phase of lockdown. Could you talk us through this report and how that differs to that one, and sort of give us some of the context about its creation?
Sure, and first of all, I need to clarify, it wasn't just me, obviously. I work at JISC, but we're also working in partnership with a range of organisations in higher education, but also and authors alongside Michelle Pawley, who's a really experienced writer in education technology, also David Maguire, who's interim principal at University of Dundee, and also JISC chair. He chaired Learning and Teaching Reimagined. So we set out in June as partners to help universities with targeted advice and guidance, peer support, but we were at the same time trying to gather insight on their immediate challenges, right? And in all honesty, we didn't uncover any real surprises, and I was grateful that you covered the interim report. You know, universities had obviously delivered tremendous response in shifting online. There was a lot of learning from that, but really what we uncovered was a collective lack of maturity in blended learning at scale, or online learning at scale. I mean, you see, we've got some notable exceptions, right? We've got a world-leading open university. So that was the difference. Change and challenge for students was really a short and sharp focused view of what had happened in spring. This report's different. This report sets out a roadmap for the future, we think.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, we'll get into the sort of the roadmap and the recommendations towards the end, but there are a few pieces I want to pick up. The place I guess I really wanted to start is you call out 7 specific sector challenges, and it would be great just at a super high level if you could just position those, just so we kind of get a sense of where you think the roadblocks are, you know, the things that we're going to have to get through.
Yeah. So I'll give it a go. We identified 7 challenges, and they kind of emerged through August, September time in our research. You know, putting digital at the heart of university culture. Well, digital transformation reflects a shift, right, for any organisation. It's as much a people thing as a process thing and a technology thing being a technical term, of course. And so, you know, it requires attention. In terms of investment, there are pressures on university resources, right? There's pressures on any organisation at the moment through the pandemic. So balancing out investments between physical and digital campus will mean there are some really difficult choices to make. And we can't overlook the fact that a reliance on technology, a greater reliance on technology, is going to impact, and unfortunately we will see heightened exposure to cybersecurity incidents. So future investments require really close strategic attention at the most senior levels of a university. And alongside that shift in finances, we think that blended learning, quality blended learning, if it's to be affordable and sustainable, requires system-wide attention. Maybe we'll dig into what that means a little bit further on. For universities themselves, redesigning learning and teaching will present challenge, but it's as much a challenge as an opportunity, right? There's plenty of experts and lecturers that we engaged who are really positive about the change. They think bringing students much more closely into the design and delivery process has a lot more benefits and opportunities. So I don't mean just the typical student either, right? It's about considering all students and what their requirements might be. Onwards, I guess digital confidence is something that was striking throughout. There's not the depth of skills, and the research to date, even before COVID backed this up, there's just not the depth of skills and focus on digital as part of the academic toolkit or part of the professional services toolkit in a university. And increasing skills and confidence, we think, is really sort of will help unlock the challenge there. We've seen signs of improvement, but we think that onwards, as we recover as well, it's going to be really important to ensure that we're kind of keeping staff and students motivated to maintain their kind of attention and focus on digital and kind of enhancing the learner experience, not just to kind of fall back and be thrilled that, the pandemic's over. So there's also kind of, attitudes are changing, but there's some myths to bust about online. It's perceived to be cheap or an easy alternative, and that's not necessarily the case. And online is part of blended, and we kind of think that universities themselves can help by communicating benefits, but also addressing some of the things that actually appear to be problematic. And, we've learned a lot through COVID. It's been really interesting to see where students feel value. They've missed social connectedness. They really value aspects of the campus experience so much more than anyone that works in universities really thought. So understanding and helping universities or universities themselves kind of being more clear about what's attractive and appealing in the experience, just going to heighten and broaden their appeal, right? And finally, digital poverty. It's a significant issue and needs some really careful and focused attention right now. There shouldn't be barriers such as this to higher education that we see today.
Yeah, that's wonderful, and I want to come back to digital poverty. You well know, and the audience well knows that I am incandescent. The fact that we still have this conversation, but I do want to pick up specifically around blended learning. And you said so many of the I guess the challenges that you talk through there have blended learning at its heart, and there's a number of things. So one, I love the fact that you've already called out, and I have this challenge all the time, is, when you talk about blended learning, or for me, I talk about flexible working, the outcome is the same, is that in the mindset of the listener, it's like, oh, so you're never going into the office then, or you're never going into college, right? So I love that. But for the uninitiated, talk to me about, explain and expand what blended learning could be if it's done right.
Yeah. So blended learning, we say in the report, is a mixture of in-person and online. That's it. We're going to keep it as simple as that. And I think it bears that simplicity at this stage.
Yeah.
There's a huge range of blended learning, right? I was in a conference session last week, virtual conference session, and two US speakers were very proud of the fact that I identified 15 types of blended learning, and it was, that was kind of of interest, but not massively helpful. And I think it's so important right now in the pandemic, as we still are, not to get too hung up on definitions or make judgments, right, about what's the best, because we're still in the thick of things, and we probably lack the perspective. We probably lack the time to have for proper consideration, and probably lack the ideal circumstances for sound judgment. That's not to say any judgments we make right now are kind of irrelevant, but rather we stepped very much away in our reporting and our work from setting new definitions or creating new models, because we just thought now's not the right time, and actually let's get on with doing the work. Let's not get hung up on the definitions. And also, importantly, we think context's really important. So the flavour of blended learning that a university focuses on really does matter in terms of the student, the support that's available for them, and importantly, the subject matter, really importantly, the subject matter. So there'll be very different approaches to blended in future. So that's why we've kind of held to the simplicity for the sake of the warring tribes as well, as there are, because academic existence is pretty tribal. That's how we extend knowledge and understanding. So I make no criticism in that, but actually we deliberately and determinedly stepped away from it, and hopefully that was a helpful move to make.
No, well, from my perspective, I do. And it's funny, I hadn't really thought about it until just now, but there are so many similarities between a conversation about remote working or dispersed working,
Yeah.
flexible working, and this. And what certainly I've found and what I talk to people about is how flexible working is a massively personal choice, and it depends on so many variables, like, you know, the state that you're in your career, your family status, your age. You know, all of these are factors that
Your
will dictate
income,
your
your
income.
space at home, totally,
Exactly.
totally.
And I would
Yeah.
imagine in a very similar way, your sort of propensity to blended learn, I think I've just made that up, is going to be, you know, dependent on a similar range of variables like that. And so I
Yeah.
think the challenge for people in the same way as the world of work is to provide a suitable spectrum of choice. You know, it's not an infinite spectrum, but it is a suitable
Yeah.
spectrum that's appropriate for that institution and maybe even for that, you know, particular content or course or whatever. Do you think that's fair?
Yeah. And I think universities are experiencing that right now, right? So
Yeah.
they are, some of them are offering hybrid, and in the kind of 2021 academic year that we're currently in, right? It's arguably harder than it was when everyone was online in March
Yeah.
1920, because they are offering choice. So they are offering online to international students. They're offering online options to self-isolating students. They're also offering in person at the same time to students who are on campus and really enthusiastic about attending. That's pretty difficult. Now, some universities, in fact, I think Alec Cameron in our advisory board is pretty interested in developing hybrid, really introducing really high level of flexibility in the offering. But not all universities are going to be able to go down that road for reasons of their curriculum, for reasons of their kind of core services and support. So it is complex, and it won't be the same model for all.
And building on that, Louisa, I would imagine there's quite a danger in trying to be all things to all people in that sense. You know, to me, that just means that you're going to be nothing to anybody. Do you know what I mean?
Maybe. Show me an organisation and company that manages to be all things to all people really, really. And I don't think that's what universities are about, right? So
Yeah,
no,
but
probably
but I
not.
but I
Probably
guess
not.
that's my point in a sense, is that the institution, and it might be at a faculty level. I wonder if they're going to need to agree some broad principles of their approach to blended. Like, this is how far
Yeah,
we're going to go, and this is
yeah,
what we're not going to do. That probably makes
yeah,
sense to me, to establish some core parameters so that
yeah.
then the staff and the students can figure out what's possible to give them some core
Are
guidance.
really are really clear, and also have their expectations set beforehand, so they're not in course wondering why there's a radically different approach to geography, as you know, their mate who happens to be studying ancient history or whatever. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
there'll be different choices to be made, but that kind of students were clear with us. They wanted more transparency, more clarity about the differences, and that's just kind of, you know, um, bears to the emergency response that
yeah.
we've just experienced. So it's understandable, but for future, we can certainly deal with it differently.
No, okay. No, look, this feels like a kind of obvious question, and maybe it is. You know, blended learning is nothing new, right? It's been around for a while. Is it simply the pandemic, a bit like again in the world of work, that has shoved everybody into this position that finally we've got people's attention, or is something else happening as well?
Um, Maybe a bit of both, right? I think we're lucky in the UK that before the pandemic, we had some of the world leading experts in technology enhanced learning, as it's known, right, in the UK, was known to date. Um, but there simply wasn't experience at scale. And we spoke to leads and influencers in the UK and internationally. And the story was so similar. They were like, well, we've tried this in XYZ courses, right? Or we have centers of excellence where we've begun to introduce it. There's a few courses that we're offering online, but just absolutely not through the breadth of the curriculums. It was a matter of, oh my goodness, let's try something different. We need a different set of mechanisms. We need emergency response. And out of that emergency response, gain really quickly, there was a huge amount of experience and a kind of, this is okay. You know, some bits really not okay. Let's fix those, but some bits okay. And so really it was a shift. And I've been saying recently, I've worked at JISC, worked in technology for education research for nearly 20 years, right? And I've been failing to make the case for research for nearly 20 years, right? And along comes the pandemic and does the work. And that's not to be glib, this pandemic has caused trauma and had devastating consequences. But there are some good things that will come from the pandemic and continue to come. So, yeah, there was a lot of expertise, but it was relatively niche. And you could argue on that point, but relatively speaking, it was niche. And so this has really opened people's eyes to what's possible. And I also think it's not just blended learning. It's also about, to your kind of core interest about the future of work, it's also opened up possibilities in and around remote working for universities that they just didn't have before. Universities did not operate in kind of flexible working environments. A lot of work and effort was campus-based, physical-based, and it just wasn't a thing. And so suddenly and we had this conversation through the advisory board and we ran sessions on culture and had conversations in and around the kind of changes that were starting to emerge. And frankly, collaborative tools and softwares that weren't used before had been used through the pandemic, right? So decisions were taken differently. Communications happened differently. More transparency, more inclusion, and I mean inclusion in a really broad sense. So more people were involved, and that kind of helped flatten out, broaden out, bust through some of the silos. This is all kind of common stuff if you've worked in other sectors, right? You've heard this story before through transformation, but suddenly the opportunities opened up for different kinds of conversations and ways of working. And very clearly, there's a lot of university leaders that are really grateful and welcome that change. So that's what's also going on here. It's not just about the learning and teaching experience per se.
Yeah, I wonder. I mean, I want to come back to that a bit later on in the conversation when we start to talk about, if you like, the business model of higher education and how that might change. Yeah. But I do think, and I'm seeing this same thing. I think it was, against this most terrible of contexts. It's given people an opportunity to break free of the inertia, to try and investigate these things and figure out, well, actually, what could we do? And that's going to be nothing but good, I think, as we go forward. I think the bit that's really interesting to me, and I know if you go back to the spring, and what we saw happen was a lot of people just take their offline stuff and like, well, okay, well, let's just put it online, right? Because that's kind of what you do. And we're realizing that actually maybe that's not right. But this sort of shift about how we think about the content side of sort of higher education. What sort of advice would you give to sort of lecturers and staff in terms of thinking about what's good content in a blended world?
That's quite a question, Dave. It's an epic question.
And you see, I resisted saying pedagogy as well, because that word scares me. But...
I'll say I'm not a pedagogy expert, so I'm not sure I'm the best person and to ask. I mean, I'll try some thoughts, right? I'll try some thoughts. And don't get me to define pedagogy. I'll leave that to you.
All right.
We talked about context really matters. Especially subject matter. It can be really difficult to incorporate blended learning into practical courses, STEM courses, or creative subjects. And from the research and the conversations we had, we really think pedagogy must be in the lead here, right? It's the pedagogy that's the thing, learning and teaching approach that's taken, student outcomes that matter. It's not the technology. The technology is just the enabling part, even in the digital transformation, right? Technology is still in a kind of enabling part. And we're fully advocating that leaders in learning and teaching kind of support curriculum redesign. And that means going back to the basics. I mean, and affordability is an issue, but going back to understand purpose and focus and homeschooling kids, stealing biscuits.
I hope they offer you one.
No. Just loving self-isolating. 1 week. there are issues of affordability that will challenge, but we are encouraging a continuation of this kind of sector-wide conversation that we've seen in the response to COVID and through Learning and Teaching Reimagined. Like for us, like there's onwards work to be done that really helps kind of look otherwise at how content might be created, that from the student's role, from the lecturer's role, but also in terms of purchasing and kind of what really are needed by universities, because affordability is really problematic, and some universities are already recognizing that in the short to mid-term they'll be really challenged to kind of sustain access to the really the highest quality of online learning materials that they'd like to do so. So, you know, there's been a lot of initiatives over the years that I can recall in the last 20 years that looked at open learning resources, but they often failed through lack of sustainability or lack of quality. And so, but these are times that are changed, so it may be worth going back and having a look again at those. I mean, it really is a big question, this one on content. And someone like Professor Anne Carlisle at Falmouth had some really interesting perspectives there. But again, the answers won't be forever the same for everyone. That's for sure.
No, totally. And I want to come back to Professor Carlisle later on. But it's this sort of transition of the role of lecturers as well, presumably. You know, their role in a blended world changes significantly, doesn't it?
Oh, it's a sensitive issue, this, and not all not all lecturers will welcome changes to their role and contribution. You know, rightly so, they should be proud of their work and the difference they make. And the UK is very proud of its world-leading system, right? And that system is built on their contribution. So let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Yeah.
But necessarily, right? If universities choose curriculum redesign, that will entail some changes, or there's opportunity for changes in their roles. So from our research, actually, we learned small scale sample, right? In the hundreds, not the thousands, but they were largely positive. Thought there was a bit of an opportunity here. Thought when we explored scenarios for 21 as well, many of the conversations we had from very different roles in the university, we chose deliberately. That's why we went really broad, right? A lot of the conversation focused on how to strengthen support to lecturers. And some universities are already doing that. Some universities, and this is a poor expression because it mangles the use of blended, kind of creating blended teams for blended learning. Right? So there's increased and heightened multidisciplinary support going in for that. And I think, and this is a personal view, I think there's a lot of similarities to changes that we've seen in technology spaces. So parallels to the shift to product management, a bit of agile, multidisciplinary roles shaping that product, the course. But as I said, you know, some universities have been doing this for quite some while. They've been bringing in library or learning resource expertise into the kind of the development of the curriculum. So there's a really kind of rounded view of it, but that's only likely to increase.
No, and I mean I love that, and you're absolutely right to call out the challenge that's being faced by the teaching staff, I guess. And first of all, you know, God, just like everybody else in education, I know that they sort of moved heaven and earth to get through the pandemic, and I totally understand that. The other bit of this, I think, is there is no one answer. The bit I love about sort of teaching staff right across the board, not just in higher education, is I think they're universally joined by this common purpose, which is the joy of helping other people develop and nurture whatever talents they have. And I think that's kind of a superpower in this conversation, because as long as we can get to a place where people can share ideas, and there is no, you know, you've said it many times, there's no single answer, but there's lots of great ideas and lots of examples of where it worked well, or maybe it didn't work well, but being able to facilitate that conversation, you know, across institutions as well as across departments to try and understand and learn this. And I think that's part of it for me is nurturing nurturing this culture in the teaching staff to be, a bit like the students, curious, to want to, test things, to try and find out. And I think it's creating an environment for them to be able to do that against the backdrop of one of your, sector challenges, giving them the skills. And also I think we shouldn't underestimate giving them the confidence to want to embrace that stuff. I think that's so important for us right now, to help, these people continue to do the amazing stuff they do, but to deliver it in a slightly different vector, if that's appropriate for what they're trying to make happen.
I totally love your framing of them as superheroes, and also like not forgetting universities are brilliant at being innovative and creative, right? That's what their research. That's what research is, roughly, and so I think in the report we say, make that a way of doing business, and their way of doing business is offering and shaping learning and teaching experiences, is kind of, understanding and creating amazing student experiences. So there's a lot in that. There's a lot of good things in that, but it recognizing that it won't be comfortable for everyone, and that, as you said, it's been epic, and the level of change and disruption has been significant. And so, we kind of need to work through this patiently and in a really supportive way. From that, good things will flow. Be really human about what everybody's experienced. We all need a bit of that, but
no, exactly.
Particularly, must be so stressful to have your whole kind of way of working thoroughly disrupted when you're in course and in delivery. And so can you imagine? That's tough.
No, massively unsettling. It also occurs to me, and there's another sort of the show's regular contributors has always sort of made this point to me, which I think is genius, is, within an institution, there's an opportunity to do some, I don't know how to phrase it, sort of reciprocal learning. So, for example, I've been doing a little bit of work with the School of Digital Arts at Manchester Metropolitan University. And so the conversation there is around, with your media studies and some of the art students, could you build a media lab that is then used by other faculties to, develop and deliver an experiment with that content, and creating that community within the institution that has both the technical capability and understanding that, to be honest, many people will lack, but then matches that with their joy of, wanting to teach and their joy of learning or opening up learning for people, and use that within the institution as a way of developing not just content, but developing techniques and a sort of a methodology about how to collaboration.
Right. Yeah. Thoroughly useful skills for the rest of your life. Yeah.
And also, I mean, it's Gary who talks about this, but I kind of like it because I do have this sort of pet theory. I think about my son, and I think about sort of our collective kids in that generation, and they're not going to want to sit on some crappy Teams call, in the same way that I didn't really want to sit on a crappy conference call. They're going to want to engage in a very different kind of way. They'll have seen a very different style of engagement. They'll have access to all of the tools. Many of them have got them in their bloody bedrooms now, and they're live streaming games. So actually carrying that forward into education, carrying that forward into their world of work becomes just sensible. So let's just flip gears slightly. This sort of blended learning, it sort of sells us close to the business model, but one of the sort of the bits of conversation that we've seen happen, and also, I mean, the government talked about it in further education about halfway through the pandemic and opening up learning, is this sort of, and again, forgive the word, modularization of learning. Okay, sounded good when I said it, but now I'm not so sure. But basically, so deconstructing what would be a big contiguous degree into a series of essentially, plug and play components, a pick and mix approach to education. Does blending learning offer us, an opportunity to make that happen, to make that work?
So the current government administration appears very supportive of modularization. In fact, I'm going to get this right. QAA, it's another acronym. Quality Assurance Agency. There's some great people there. They're currently doing some research into this for university opinions, and it's due to report before Christmas, probably before the end of November. So not thoroughly clear quite where universities are at with it, but some, like the Open University, really enthusiastic, really keen if it suits their market
Mm.
profile. But yeah, blended learning, to get to your question, blended learning does probably offer the foundations because of the flexibility. It offers more opportunities for different flexible provisions. So it probably helps lay the foundations and further extend the possibilities when it comes to modularization. We didn't explore it much in the research, but it seems to be the direction of travel, certainly from the political winds, if not universities. Be interesting one to watch.
Yeah, definitely. And also, I mean, we talked about this earlier. We got enough on right now without throwing that into the mix, if you know what I mean. So we'll get through the sort of the bigger, more prescient challenges first, and then we'll come to that. So look, let's very much switch gears now. I want to talk to you sort of about strategy on an institutional level. And one of the challenges you called about this sort of this need to invest in the short term with a view to the long term. And in the report, one of the bits that I thought was really good, and I'm used to seeing reports about the future. I spend my life at 50,000 feet, 20 years in the future, with no idea how to get from here to there, right? So you not only talk about a strategic framework, you also provide one. Talk us through that.
Yeah.
What kind of tools have you built to help institutions build their strategy?
Yeah, I think that's one of the things we're most proud of with this piece of work. So we're just not just positioning what's possible. We are giving tools for university leaders, but those involved in university change, the ability to stop and think. So we frame some questions, not the answers, right? So we've tried to answer three questions with supporting resources. So one, what does the future look like? Well, we don't claim to know the answers. I've talked earlier about we might not have the best perspective right now when we're in the middle of a pandemic, but we've shared some visions and some scenarios to help inspire. So we just asked university leaders, and we've asked some ed tech startups, and we're wide open, actually. Any of your viewers are interested in sharing, we're still looking for those visions of 2030, because we think it's really important to have a look at what's possible, what's preferable, and kind of shape a future through that. And so the very act of creating a vision of the future, actually, one university leader in particular said, was just hugely energizing. It just took him to a different place and really helped him, motivate him. So it can be really enjoyable. The second question is, what do I need to know now? We've created some primers. It's a very education term, right? The foundational guides. Know your audience. So we had some really candid conversations with university leaders. They just said, we don't get some of the basics here. They just don't have the fundamental knowledge of technology because they've never needed it before. It just wasn't part of parcel of their business. And there's an awful lot of geek speak out there, or kind of sales stuff, and they just wanted something that helped cut them through. And not just about technology, about technology enhanced learning too. So we've created some primers, we'll create some more. We've also created some collated some of the best advice and guidance that we can find, and want to signpost those for those doing a deeper dive. And then the third one is hopefully the most substantial, is a strategic framework which really doesn't have the answers but sets out the key questions that leaders need to make. We're very aware, we identified really early on that leaders were interested in reshaping their strategies or developing an investment case, and so we've set those out. We've also because we feel that developing strategy is a collaborative thing, right? It might be for the likes of you, Dave, that sit in your glorious ivory tower of isolation and kind of think about the future. But we think that when you're actually shaping strategy, way better to do it collaboratively. And knowing that a lot of people would have to do it remotely, we kind of went into the JISC archive for that and pulled our experts together, and they've created some tools, some collaborative sessions that just help you bust open some of the thinking. There's very much design-led thinking in the mix there, because we think that'll really help. Start with your purpose, start with your users, and kind of build out from that. So hopefully they'll be useful too. Time will tell, of course.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think absolutely they will. And I think what I loved about that right at the beginning is creating a source of inspiration and aspiration, because we desperately need that right now. And I would imagine if it's anything like the world of work, having a sort of a whiff of optimism about what we might do as a result of the terrible circumstances to come out of this a bit better off. What's not to like about that? To give you the context for what the changes that you might need to make. But we talk about this again. It comes back to money, doesn't it? And again, you talk in the report about most institutions had to spend anywhere between $1 million to $3 million just to cope with the early phase of the pandemic. Never mind the sort of the longer term implications. Is that the challenge with digital? Do we see digital as being this continual sort of cycle of investment? Is it something that becomes cheaper over time? How do you see that playing out?
It requires continual investment. The nature and shape of that depends on the level of the ambition of the university. I mean, that's being really glib, but it's true. One of the interesting things, we really struggled to find evidence of where and how universities spend their money on digital elements of learning and teaching, because it's not tracked and understood in those terms. It was pretty easy to find how much money they spent on their physical campus. It was also pretty easy to find out how much they spent on elements of IT, but not actually specifically for learning and teaching. And so we could make an estimate comfortably based on speaking with some leaders about how much they might have spent in the emergency response. But then onwards, we really feel that it needs quite some considerable effort to understand and explore and consider kind of what the profile of that onwards investment is. And we talk about the difference between physical and digital. We just think there needs to be balancing up and out, to acknowledge and respond to the fact that digital is probably more important to them than it was previously, and therefore they need to invest accordingly.
Yeah, no, okay. And I wanted to call out that sort of conversation about physical versus digital because, historically, there's a lot about a university in its buildings, if you know what I mean. Some cases it's status, some cases it's facilities. Do you think that changes that dynamic now? Do you think, if you're sat there as a leader of an institution, you're going to think very differently, about the physical side of what you do?
I think universities are already doing it, and in the sort of last 6 weeks of the initiative, we were, or the run up to the report, I should say, I talked a lot with estates directors, and they were already reprofiling their consideration. The physical social distancing of COVID has had a significant impact on their budgets, but also already their way of thinking about their kind of physical assets. So they're already there, but in terms of shifting the perspective of perception of digital, it's, we talk about the digital campus deliberately and purposefully. There's arguably way too much difference and distance between those beautiful, glorious buildings or very shiny, brand new buildings with fabulous facilities, and actually what that experience was in a student's hand on mobile or on their laptop. And we definitely feel that there's a lot more to be done to, before we get to fluid students moving fluidly between physical and digital. There's some pretty basic things to be done to kind of just marry up and make sure that there's coherence between the physical and the digital. And that's going to require investment, really is. Yeah. And it won't be necessary for everyone. And some will be already well advanced in it. But yeah, there's work to be done there.
And does that then lead into the sort of conversation that we signposted earlier about the sort of the changing nature of the business model of universities? Does this start to mark a world where I'm now open for business to students from anywhere in the world without them having to leave wherever they are in the world?
Yeah, well, it might do. Yeah, it might do for some. It provides them huge opportunities. So core in the strategic framework is one of the central pillars there is looking at your business model and understanding what it is that you're aspiring to offer and really targeting resources effectively. There's a number of the university's leaders that we spoke to that have real interest in scaling up and taking UK higher education further to other markets and doing so digitally. Not exclusively digitally and not exclusively online, but exploring what that looks like through a variety of means. Yeah.
That's really interesting to me because I think it also speaks to the change that I think is at the heart of this. And so when you launched the report, we had Professor Anne Carlisle, who's talking about the shift that's happening in terms of students. And I'm just going to read it because it was quite a lovely quote. She talked about putting the student at the centre, but specifically she talked about the shift from learner to user, where students are no longer vessels to be filled with knowledge, but are instead an integral part of the collective experience. I thought that, well, to me, that felt quite profound in terms of the change and the sort of the cultural change that's at the heart of what's happening in universities. And I'd love to know a bit more about that. I mean, what does that mean for institutions, for lecturers and staff? And what does that mean for leaders as they try and sort of navigate that?
I think it's a big deal. I think it's a really big deal. And we talked a bit about Anne. She's not the only one, but she has very clear in her views that she thinks this is an opportunity. And I've got to say, personally, like, why wouldn't you want to involve students? You talked to yourself earlier, Dave, and they're like smart, they're highly engaged, they are kind of, they want to be involved and more involved. They're very clear on that. Well, harnessing that energy and impetus could take you to who knows where. So there's huge potential, huge untapped potential there. And I think that's just the start, really. And how university leaders want to go about that and academics want to go about that, they need to think about. I mean, I think one thing that's important to say is, it's not the students aren't the pedagogic experts, but as users, you wouldn't expect them to be, right? But they've got a perspective and they've got something to offer. And so already we've seen students play different roles in learning and teaching, and kind of more of that, as suits. But it's part of this experimental phase I think we're in right now. That's exciting. That's really exciting.
No, I love that. And I wonder, one of the experiences I think we have as consumers today is, I think we tend to seek out the brands that engage us and incorporate us into the overall experience. And I wonder if there comes a point where students, one of their, decision criteria about choosing where to go is to choose an institution that will engage them into, how they learn and the opportunity of developing that learning as part of, their overall experience. That has to be the direction for this.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. I could talk all day about why students as consumers was never a helpful label, right? So I'm very easily persuaded in this direction, but I must say one of the striking things that's problematic in today's experience, right, for students, very, very clearly, that they miss social engagement. It's not there in the learning and teaching platforms right now. There's a fix. Some organisations got it nailed, but not all by any stretch. And that tells us something about what they want and what they expect. That tells us something about what it is they get from the campus. It's a bonding and community experience. And if that's so valuable to them right now, there's something to work with for future. So a heightened level of engagement can only be something that's pleasing to today's students. But then, of course, and then there'll be more students that come along and there'll be changing expectations and you kind of need to keep in step. But right now there's a huge amount of opportunity just when you kind of need them, when you need them to help you shape it different.
That's no, absolutely. And I think that will be the, one of the other cultural shifts in the institution, isn't it? To be so much more in tune to looking for those signals and encouraging that kind of feedback in a way that isn't, trite, but is, meaningful and at the heart of the change of what's happening throughout the institution.
Yeah, but look, I mean, I think universities were doing pretty well. They'd shifted their mindset and their approach in terms of the physical student experience. And they had done a lot of investment there. We just hadn't seen it because there hadn't been a need to look at learning and teaching in that kind of way. So there's a lot to be done.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Okay, so that's great. I want to shift very briefly into talk about sort of the outcome of university, specifically connections into industry, but also I want to talk about the tech industry quickly. So one of the things, the great theories that has emerged from the last 6 months of having these conversations with people like you and people, more broadly in the world of work, has been how connected all of these things need to be. So even in your spring report, one of the things I found really interesting was universities were a bit were complaining about the fact that students arrived to them from school with no digital skills, and they were spending time teaching them digital skills. Equally, employers argue that when the students arrive having graduated, they don't have any of the sort of, work skills, basic or sort of office skills. And to me, it just feels like everybody's doing somebody else's job. Do you know what I mean? The schools need to make sure that we get the digital skills. They turn up at university gives them work. Do you know what I mean? So
Yeah.
Given that this is a big system, and we're making a change to one of the fundamental components of this system, are there sort of knock-on effects, do you think, of this approach to blended learning, the sort of the transformation that we're seeing in higher education? Is there a sort of an impact on what we want employers to be able to do? Does that change that relationship between employers and higher education, or is it business as usual?
Yeah, that's a great question, because one area that didn't feature through the final report, but we did explore, was in some part was in and around transition points, and I think there's a lot more work to be done there just to make those transition points more comfortable. One angle we were looking into was in and around those students with assisted needs. We haven't lingered on them, but again, just making it that bit easier. And there's much more work to be done in that. And I think universities recognise that, employers recognise that, schools too. So I think employers should want to be involved. That there's been a lot of work done in the last couple of decades in and around what's known as a knowledge transfer. There's a label for everything in education, right? Knowledge transfer. So that's mostly driven by research, relationships, but now's the opportunity for universities and employers to grow that relationship out and develop it further. I mean, developing partnerships that help respond to the skills that we'll need as our economy and society, recovers from the pandemic. So there's a lot of opportunity there, and I think a recognition in universities themselves that employers can and will play a role onwards. So that could really deal with some of the problems you've just described, right?
And look, I mean, it's a personal view of mine anyway, but I would love to see that. And I think there are, some institutions are smashing it as far as I can see. There are others, have a different focus, but it's something we need to do. Let me just get really parochial just for a minute, and let's talk about the tech industry. And let's talk about whether the tech companies can help in this transition with institutions. And I get, one of the things that's been really interesting to me over the last few months as I've sort of delved further into education is the sort of the Marmite reaction you tend to get when people find out you're a technologist talking about education, because they're sort of waiting for he's going to sell me something, isn't he? He's going to sell me something, and there was a time that maybe I would have done. Right? I'm not selling anything right now. Do you think, and specifically, big tech companies, and I know that the UK is awash with fantastically brilliant, inspiring, tech ed companies who are doing amazing things. I want to talk about sort of Google and Microsoft specifically. Is there a role for them to play? They must have I would imagine they would have a global view of what's happening in higher education. Is there a role that they can play in helping this happen, or are they simply there just to take orders?
Maybe they can play a role. I learned this great Dutch phrase recently, and as I so often find with Dutch phrases, it just sums up my feelings really well. The knife cuts both ways, all right? And I think that there's tremendous opportunity from the technology giants, as the startups, to help universities through this. We mentioned in the report, and I think JISC firmly believes that the future for technology is an ecosystem. It's not a monolithic kind of setup. That's unhelpful. And in terms of competition too, maybe the big five tech giants, they feel like competition right now to universities. They've made tremendous inroads into education and through schools, through colleges, through universities. But I wonder whether or not it's the likes of Dyson. So Dyson recently was allowed to award degrees in the UK, right? And that status is hard won.
Yeah.
And so that could make it a shift. But ultimately, I do wonder, with that kind of market pressure, if ultimately universities might look back one day and think that COVID was something to be grateful for, because it made the burning platform really present for them, and will help them shift onwards. So in a way that kind of that slow creeping burn, you just don't from incoming forces. But I would say also globally there's a tremendous network of experts that exists, that JISC is part of, and some of our partners are part of, and universities are part of. Very, very collegiate at scale and across countries. So that's also an opportunity for those already in the system.
Yeah, I absolutely. It comes back to this whole thing about sharing, doesn't it? And I get, look, there's a competitive angle on a number of levels here, but really this understanding of what's possible. My frustration, and I'll talk about, my friends at Microsoft. Sorry, that sounded threatening. I didn't mean it in any way. They're genuinely friends.
We can threaten away.
But it was, I was always frustrated that we could never. It was always about product. It was never about look at what we enable, and you only really see it in pockets. And I think the opportunity, and so this is, I think, your opportunity, Google and Microsoft, is to rock up with solutions that aren't necessarily tied to your technology, but show us, who's doing this well, who's understood it well, who's making great things happen. I know these organizations, have incredible evangelists. I've worked with many of them who really, get this, but it's having it's being free of the commercial pressure, I think, to flog a platform to be able to have those conversations, and that's where I'd love to see it go.
Well, okay. We would too, but JISC would see that as its own role. So we would say that there's an opportunity there too, absolutely agnostic of the kind of product elements of the offer.
Yeah, and I should have called that out. I mean, for me, I'm incredibly, if you like, naive and optimistic, and it's kind of why I do what I do and why I've always done what I've done. The opportunity of technology is too great, but we need to inspire. We need to show people what's possible. They're going to build it, right? Anyway, but I would much rather show you what, and you talked about it with the strategic framework. I think there's a lot of people right now who simply, and this sounds derogatory, and I don't mean it in any way derogatory, lack the ability to think about what's possible in this world, because it's not been their world. They don't sit like me in a bloody cave full of wires and stuff like that. They've got other more important things to do. But I think it's up to us now to show them, look, this becomes possible, and I'm not saying that's the right thing to do, but why don't we experiment with it? And that's, I think, the opportunity for technologists in this conversation, because we're not education specialists, but we do understand how these things come together, and we do have some experience in what's coming. So it's the marrying of these worlds.
Yeah, and we haven't lingered on that, and I do think it's an important point to make, that we've got there's a place and a need right now for inspiration that is tech led, that goes the wow, and they just like bust your understanding. We haven't focused on any of that today. I'm really sorry, but it's kind of, we're in this space where we need to make sure that digital transformation, learning and teaching feels comfortable, feels safe, and feels appropriate. And kind of the excitement kind of comes, but there's a time and a place for that, which arguably isn't where we're at right now at this point.
But yeah, well, look, I couldn't agree more. I think it's about being grounded. The last thing I need now is somebody rocking up with a VR headset telling me, do you know what I mean? Just go away. Tell me what I can do. So it is that, and that to me was always good evangelism, right? It was never come and look at this amazing technology. It's more about look at what this amazing technology can enable you to do in your environment. Yeah. So look, let's shift then into sort of the recommendations and conclusions of the report, and I think they were really interesting. So you call out 9 recommendations, and I'll put them up on the screen so the viewers can see. But can you just sort of at a really high level, just walk us through what you felt the main recommendations were?
Sure. So it's fairly obvious stuff, I guess. And you've got to remember, we're making recommendations for a whole sector that's very diverse. It's so the points of emphasis, I guess, are as such. Think carefully about what it'll take to transform the talent, the culture, the approach. It's just fundamental, but it's really important. In terms of investment, there's hard choices to be made, and making sure that there's solid information, that they're focused on long-term ambitions, that avoids knee-jerk, but also is prepared to take risks because there's not an extensive set of evidence to base this stuff on at scale, as we've talked about. In terms of cybersecurity, it was our advisory board that was so clear that cybersecurity got prominence in the recommendations. So these are like 12 vice chancellors or equivalents, and so interesting that this is a requirement from them, because
I was really surprised to see that, like as high up as it was. I mean, it's obvious, but it's still, it was,
but it's also a global problem right now, and not one that's going away, and it's an expensive problem too, which is why it's so high up. And we talked earlier about thinking radically, need to think about where we spend monies and consider opportunities to shape a sustainable and affordable response. Accelerating blended learning, well, scaling up in all senses, right? Huge amounts of expertise exist, but it's a matter of going large, and inevitably that brings with it some challenge. Inclusivity and accessibility, I'm just thrilled that these are something that we've secured unanimous support for, because, and personally I'd go further. I said this isn't just about inclusivity and accessibility for students with additional needs or even those with particular preferences, right? In future, this is more important as universities consider personalised learning. It's the learning for the individual, and it's their outcomes as individuals that goes beyond anything else of importance, right? Now that's not easily done, but really important, and gained huge support from those we engaged with. Confidence, we talked quite a bit about confidence. So confidence is key, and supporting everyone in their use of technology. And some of the barriers right now aren't simply confidence. There's matters of design or execution that come into the mix, but it can all be helped enormously by a bit of focus on confidence and ensuring that the provision matches expectations. So this is about research of prospective students as much as in-course students, and understanding how Generation Z learners are different to millennial learners, are different to boomers, and those are broad brush and problematic categories. But actually, if you have clarity about who your target market or markets are as a university, we shouldn't make too many assumptions, but it can be quite helpful to have a sense of what the differences are based on their experience within that generation, right? And I don't mean by this at all that Generation Z are digital natives, right? There's been a lot of research, enough said there, but right, they've had and they come with a particular set of experiences. Right now they're moving from Fortnite into Among Us, and that's really interesting problem-based stuff right there. So their expectations, their world is changing, and the university needs to shift accordingly to be attractive, right? So you can tell my fun space, this is a really interesting space. And then finally, a fundamental, we talked at the top right about digital poverty. It could not be more important. It could not be more difficult, but it needs to be dealt with, and dealt with at scale. There shouldn't be barriers to higher education. It's why I work in higher education, to ensure that the benefits and the possibilities are open to all. And as a country, we've made significant commitment and inroads to ensure that higher education was accessible. And unfortunately, right now, through COVID, through nobody's design, that barrier is there, and it needs resolving with swift attention.
And look, so you've just laid out all of those. I want to pick up on the last one first, and then we'll go backwards. But so talk to me about digital poverty. It's not uniquely your problem, but what are the things that uniquely higher education can do to contribute to its eradication?
Well, universities are taking measures. They're setting up special funds. They're kind of learning better how to assess students coming into a course, especially if special kit is required or special software is required, just kind of dealing with that right from the outset. But there are issues in the pandemic of space as much as there are access to data, as much as there are to kind of all of the other parts. So a highly unusual set of circumstances that they're pretty stretched right now to respond to. So JISC, along with other organisations, have shared to government, and government are considering the options. And in the devolved nations too, they're looking at apportioning funding. So funding has been made available, but the response varies depending on the devolved nation and government administration. So we're looking for a more robust response here. There's a very polite expression for it.
Yeah, no, I know, but it's hard, isn't it? And I sort of, I mean, it's a very emotive subject for me, but it's really hard to nail down, and it's something that I think over the next, well, certainly the remainder of my career, I would love to try and find a way to move this forward, because wherever you are in society, and we always have this same conversation about, oh, digital poverty is a real problem, isn't it? Yeah, it's a terrible problem. It prevents us, and then still nothing happens. And I just think, well, actually, I'm not going to trivialize it, but I'm not sure that it's that difficult. There are things that we could all do from our respective positions to solve it. We just need to crack on. It needs to become important enough for us to solve it. That's the issue.
Yeah.
So then let's talk. So the recommendation I really love, because there's, again, you're dealing with a very broad spectrum of institutions who are at different places on this journey, have different aspirations about where they want to be. What happens if people aren't able to make this journey, either are unwilling or simply don't invest in it in a big enough way? What's the outcome of that for an institution?
It's so early to say. I mean, I'll be clear, we only framed our recommendations for the relatively short term to help universities for 21-22 onwards. There'll need to be further effort and intention. And that's because, as I've said, we just don't have the perspective right now. We're in the pandemic, but we're also in this situation of tremendous experimentation. Well, we should expect to learn and adapt as we go forth. And I think some might not necessarily make the transition or the transformation in learning and teaching. They may feel that their offering is distinct and sufficient without it. That's going to be interesting to see how prospective students respond to it, and that will tell us, right? That will tell us. Maybe there will be students that will always and forever want only in-person learning and nothing else. I'd be surprised if students only and ever want in-person learning with a physical textbook and a physical book. That would be unusual, but let's see how it goes.
Yeah, no, absolutely. This sort of the PR part of me wanted you to use the phrase "adapt or die," because that's typically.
Well, Dave, I'm the geeky researcher. You're the show guy, right?
So there you go. Adapt or die. Sorry, that was very pointy. Again, one of the nice things about the journey that I've been on with trying to, tell all of these stories or understand all of these stories is looking across education and sort of seeing some similarities. And actually, maybe I'm in a better position than you to answer this question. But what I was going to say, do you think there's lessons that other parts of the education world could learn from the research that you've done and the experience that you've had in higher education?
Yeah. So it was remiss of me not to talk about it earlier, but actually I helped, I worked with Robin Gerberin, who's JISC Managing Director for Further Education. We framed a similar piece of work. It ran differently because the context's different and stakeholders are different, but we ran a similar piece. They're doing some deep dives now, but the first phase of that research found pretty much the same as we found in higher education, right? Pretty much. Yeah. And so lessons and preferences and expectations of the future, a shift in perceptions of what digital can do for learning and teaching. All of that is there in colleges. Much less well informed about what's happening in the school space, although I have the delightful experience of my kids self-isolating, so I'm learning a lot about homeschooling right now in secondary school education, right? And there's a lot to be. There's a lot of commonality, we suspect, at the heart of it, because it's a transformation of the learning and teaching experience.
Yeah, I think so, and certainly the conversation we've been having at a sort of K-12 secondary school perspective is very similar in terms of the bit that really resonated me with the work that you've done is this whole thing about skills and confidence. That's absolutely crucial to this because it is a cultural shift, and even in anecdotally in my own experience as a parent of a teenager at school, you can see the culture of different teachers massively affects the outcome of what they're prepared to do. We've had a really interesting thing where there was a massive amount of pushback about doing tests remotely. I hadn't anticipated at all, but it was a massive cultural roadblock that we had to navigate, where we simply can't do the tests remotely. And I'm like, well, why not? And then of course you get into the culture of it, and you get into the sort of the concerns people have about whether it's from cheating through to the sharing of the material and all that sort of stuff, which again I'm sort of oblivious to, but you learn more. But I think it is this sense of helping the human beings at the heart of this experience on that journey. And I think there's a lot that they could learn from the research that you've pulled together, and the stories of people who are on this journey and are learning it. So I will certainly be recommending that. Now I'm going to ask you this really ridiculously obvious and stupidly simplistic question, which is what all interviewers do at the end, right? And what's the one thing that you would, so bear with me, right? So the point is that, it is broad ranging and there are lots of things to do. If I'm an institution and I'm sitting there thinking about this stuff, what's your best advice about where to get stuck in and where to get started on this? And I get that that's a ridiculously large question, but just sort of point me in the right direction.
Yeah, sure. Back to the commonalities of digital transformation, right? What makes the biggest difference in digital transformation? It's culture, it's the people. They are motivated, they mobilize, they hull up the problems, and then they figure out some of the solutions. So, I'm no university leader, right? So I get excused from this, but I think as you've asked, it's about ensuring you have talent and allow that talent, support that talent through change and shaping onward change, and expect that things will work and differently than they have before, and that timescales will shift. And something that goes right to the heart of universities. I haven't really expressed it really well because I'm kind of mentally thinking, oh my God, this is a big difference for a university to make. They pride themselves on the kind of quality and depth and amount of consideration and amount of time. And so it's going to be important to learn and adapt, but at the same time, not throw away the things that make a university as brilliant as it is. So it's one to handle really, really carefully. And I don't envy university leaders this challenge, but with talent, they can shape whatever future or vision of the future they want.
Yeah, I love that, Louisa, and I think there's so much about this, and it feels almost trite and glib to say this, but it's all really about the humans at the centre of this, and having confidence in them, and again, I do believe probably more so than any other organisations, you are united by a common goal. All right, there might be a conflict between research and learning, but broadly speaking, we're trying to advance knowledge. And that's an opportunity. So being able to embrace that and having the confidence and trust to make that happen, I think that's really important. So on that note, Louisa, I just want to say thank you for joining us and spending a considerable amount of time with us. You must be knackered after working through this report. So I think I really, really appreciate that you took time.
Thanks, Dave. It's a total pleasure. Thanks for asking me.
Oh, no, it's great. And what I'll do is I'll put a link to the report in the comments below, so you'll get access to that. I really encourage you to sort of engage with it, and not just from a higher education perspective, but in sort of learning the transition or trying to understand the transition that we're all going through. I think that's really helpful for us all to be able to play our part. And so on that note, let me just say thanks again, Louisa, for joining us. It's been a massive pleasure to have you on. And then all that leaves me to say is thank you so much for joining us. What we'll do, as we've done in the past, is we'll do 2 editions of this. We'll do the full unedited, if you like, conversation, and then I'll also do a shortened version for those of you with short attention spans or frankly better things to do. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll be back and we will see you again next week.
There are 1,000 stories in the Envisioners' future. This is just one of them.